Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Gilda Hilaire, and I am the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Salesforce. Today, we will be discussing all things related to tracking dynamic content featuring Kevin Moran and Jenna Madsen. And this conversation will be moderated by me. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. This will be a lively, interactive discussion. And we will be sending the recording to the webinar and any links that we discuss in a follow-up email. Now, without further ado, we will get started. I love figuring out how to track dynamic content. And we're going to get things started with focused on really asking our panel today, so how to track dynamic content? What is that all about? Where would our trailblazers get started?
Kevin, you want to take that?
Jenna or Kevin?
Sure, I can start. I think it's a good question, and I think it's one of the strengths of Marketing Cloud is how flexible it is in allowing you to create dynamic content. And so conversely, there's also lots of different ways that you can then track that dynamic content. And I know one of the there's from using impression region tracking. So that's kind of built into the platform, so you can create containers, as it were, for content that will change within that and report on that. You can do custom tracking. So if you're using like AMP scripts and logging to data extensions, you can have a lot of control over how you track your dynamic content. You have the built-in send log feature, which is a standard data extension that you can use to track content across all your sends. Let's see, Jenna, what other ways can you think of that you could use to track content?
There's lots of different ways. Of course, there's the alias tags you can use to track dynamic content. Those are, of course, specific to links, but you can also make your links dynamic and your alias tags dynamic, being able and track those. And then, of course, there's the WAC, the Web Analytics Connector, or the parameters tracker that allows you to track dynamic content within the Marketing Cloud, and then externally as well, with Google Analytics or with Adobe Omniture, or I'm mixing that up. Omniture isn't Adobe. Someone correct me there. But it allows you to pull tracking out of the Marketing Cloud and or port those tracking parameters out to an external service to be able to track there as well with the WAC. So there's lots of different ways to go around setting up dynamic tracking, and it can be a little bit overwhelming whenever you first go in there. So my best recommendation is to start slow and really analyze what content you're passing through to your end subscriber, what is dynamic, and then really thinking about how those are tagged, how the impression regions are tagged, and then how the alias tags are tagged, and how they're working in tandem with your reporting systems.
And I think you just touched on something that's really key there too, in terms of like starting slow, and that's like thinking about what it is or why you want to do the tracking. Because you're right, there's so many ways of doing it, but depending on how you want to then read the results can really depend about how you go out implementing your tracking. Because I know we work with some people, and it's really their maybe it's not the people who are in Marketing Cloud who want to know. So maybe then you need to focus on how do you set up the Web Analytics connector properly so that you get that reporting on the website. Or it could be where if it is the person who's using Marketing Cloud, then it's, is it easier to use sort of built-in tools like impression region tracking, or are they comfortable setting up their own data extensions to track? So I think it does depend on how you're going to consume it.
Exactly, those end results.
Can I just ask a question? I think you both had mentioned the send log, and for some of our audience that's not familiar with the send log, can you speak a little bit more about the send log? And it comes natively with the application, but what are some of the other things they need to know about the send log and how it's part of tracking dynamic content?
Do you want to start, Diana?
Who wants to start? Okay, well, the send log, there is a send log that comes with the application or with the platform, and you can have it enabled in your platform. It can track anything you pretty much tell it to. You do have to tell it to track emails in the user initiated sends or in the send definitions whenever there's a little checkbox at the bottom that says track via the tracking log or the send log.
Send
and
log, yeah.
it will allow, send log tracking there. But there's a couple different ways to implement that. And sorry, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here in my head. I want to talk about something real quick. Whenever you're taking into consideration the send log, if you don't have it already initiated in your account and you do want to turn it on, say after you get out of this session or whatever, look at your account's creation date and find out how old your account is. And you might have to work with support a little bit to make sure that the send log is accessible through all the builders and all the studios across the platform, depending on how old your account is. I've run into some issues before where the send log wasn't tracking, say, Journey Builder because the account was older than the Journey Builder application itself. So,
and I think also just when you, if I remember correctly, you might correct me here too, Jenna. Like when you create the send log, it's a system template. Mm-hmm. So you do actually create from a template the data extension, and then it comes with some default fields for like job ID, list ID, batch ID, subscriber key. I think. Yeah.
And ID. I think they're both in there.
And then so you have to create it using that specific template, and if you don't see that option, you need to contact support. I think that depends too on the age of your account. And then you can add fields to the send log, and basically what it's like magic. Let's say if you added an extra fields to it for first name, then any data extension that you use that also has that same, or sendable data extension that has that same name of that same field of first name, the value for the subscriber in that send will magically appear in the send log. So it's a very efficient way of logging the data from your send through the platform.
Mm-hmm. With very little customization that has to go on from the user's standpoint. So.
Yeah, basically just as long as you have fields in your sendable data extension that match up to the fields in your send log, those values are automatically captured. So you put some planning into it. Let's say I think one way we see it used a lot is for segments. Like if you want to track segmentation back to a send, or if someone qualifies for something specific that you're going to use ongoing. And that's maybe the one thing, right? The send log is something that's going to capture data for every send. So you need to spend a little bit of time thinking through what you want to capture, because it grows pretty quickly.
And it is one send log for the entire account too. So that's something to take into consideration as well. If you want to create custom send logs, you'll need to create your own custom data extensions outside of that template.
Perfect. Thank you both. I think that was really helpful, because I think, a lot of the features that come dynamically with Marketing Cloud, it's hidden, right? So unless you hear about it, you really don't know how to use it. So that was really good. So thank you for that explanation. So another question is really around impression regions. Like, I know when I first started using Marketing Cloud eons ago, I didn't really know what an impression region was, and the purpose of it, why I need to use it. So can one of you speak a little bit about impression regions, and, is it too much? What do you got? What are the recommended guidelines to make the querying the data scalable? And if possible, if one of you have can demo it or just show how you can use impression tracking, that would be great.
Okay, Kevin, you want to start?
We're too polite. The two of us are too polite, waiting to steal that. So impression region tracking. So as Marketing Cloud evolved and they really gave you more options on displaying conditional content, I think it became important then, in order to see the results of that conditional content, how much were you sending out to people, who was engaging with it versus other content, because it's challenging to do that. You had to do a lot of custom work to figure it out. So the impression regions, and I think Jenna maybe will show some of this. You explicitly define an impression region with some simple AMP scripts functions. So begin impression region, and you give it a name, and then at the end of that region that you want to call it, you just close it with an end impression region function as well. And then inside of that, you can put conditional content. You can do this through the UI, it will happen, or you can do it manually in your HTML paste emails, just writing out the conditions. But basically what you're doing with the impression regions is just defining an area within your email where you're going to have content change in and out. And then the reporting is going to be based on the name of the impression region that you gave it. And I think one example that's good to kind of think about how you might want to go about using this is, if you were to serve, say you have regional content that you want to show out based on zip codes, and you have several banners, what you could do is define an impression region, right, that's tied to what the content is, and then have your statements to show out different content areas or different creative based on, say, someone's state. And then when you pull back the results, you can actually see who engaged with what piece of content and what was displayed on it. You can then nest as well inside of content areas, so it's not just a one-to-one kind of thing. Like if you had a reason to sort of have multiple levels of conditions or qualifying criteria, or different creative that you needed to do, you can nest within them. I don't think you just have to remember, the more you do, right, that it will eventually have some impact on performance. It also just give you more work in terms of figuring out your results. So I think, like we said before, it's good to kind of start slow and then work your way into it. Jenna, what do you want to add to that?
Work your way back. I was trying to pull up. I was trying to get a sample of an impression region here for us. All right, written real quick so I could show you guys what that looks like. But yeah, so okay, I'm gonna mess this up if I try to share my screen.
Yeah, so why don't you? Maybe we can do a follow-up and we can put together just something simple that shows how you would set the impression region, and then do a simple send and show the results.
That's a really good idea, rather than trying to do it here. I can show you in here, but we're not going to be able to see the results right now for that impression region tracking. So let's just go ahead and we'll pass that information out with the follow-up documentation, and show you guys some examples of how to track the begin impression region and the end impression region functions with AMP script, so you can see how to track or nest an impression region. But one thing you want to think about with impression regions, with nesting them and tracking them, is you can overdo it really quickly. Really, it's really best to get with your analytics department or whoever's going to be doing the end analysis on your broadcast, or talk to the stakeholders and find out exactly what they're trying to test into, what what they want to see from what you're doing, and kind of work backwards from there and really think about what you're doing, because if you get too many nested impression regions, it's going to be hard to analyze that data. You're going to get some conflicting results. So really think about what you're doing. And you can drive dynamic content or dynamic names into the impression regions, but you have to break if you're using AMP script, you have to kind of break apart the AMP script function and rebuild it with a concat function. And then you can drive in dynamic variables into your impression regions and identify them that way, rather than if you're using a lot of dynamic content. It is a hack though, and so if you call up Salesforce support, they're probably going to tell you you're doing it wrong. But you can do that. We'll pass out some examples of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And then, as you say, just with the impression region, so there's some sort of visual reports that you can run. It's based on send, is typically how you would pull it back. But then there's also tracking extracts. So particularly if you have larger lists, or if you want to get that data into a data mart or some other system, like for your business intelligence team to analyze, you can actually set up data extracts, and that will give you both send impressions as well as click impressions. So you can see just what the distribution was, how many people saw different impression regions and the content inside of it, but then there's a separate extract that will give you the actual engagement with the regions or the content inside of the impression regions.
Mm-hmm. And those tracking extracts are great to backfill data with if you need to go back beyond 90 days from the data views.
So we have a question actually on this. It's, does the impression region track views, or does it only track clicks of that content? A really good question.
It tracks views. It tracks the impression. So whenever that content is generated for that subscriber, it tracks that generation of that content that you specify in that impression region. It's not just around click. Your alias tracking, your click link name tracking is your tracking that is click specific.
And then another question is, for the impression region tracking, how do you easily merge the plain text so it doesn't count twice?
Kevin, do you want me to take this? You want to take that? That's the devil question. Okay, so go in and modify your text version. That's what I do to get rid of the impression tracking in there. You do want it though. You know, that's a hard question. Maybe Kevin, do you have a good answer for that one? I always go in and modify my impression regions in my text version, and that way you can identify those uniquely from your text to your from your text to your HTML version if you want to get that granular with it. If not, you can look at and see whose images flew instead of the that might work. You might be able to analyze who the open tag, because the open tag is an image tag. So you might be able to analyze who opened the email, and then kind of do some math to figure out who opens which version.
I'd love to know a little bit more about the question on the terms of, you know, merging the plain text so it doesn't count twice. The standard's going to be around send impressions, so not necessarily opens per se. So I don't think, if you're worried about the count of impressions being served, it's not going to count it twice between the HTML and the plain text version.
Yeah. Now it does for the coupon codes. I think that's maybe what they were asking about, is like, you know, the coupon codes will count twice in the claim row for if you're claiming a row for AMP script. Anyways, I'm diverging.
Yeah, so I think it'd be good to have a, I don't know if that person that asked that question can maybe expand on it a little bit more and we can come back to
Yeah.
it.
So Carrie, if you are still on the call, please feel free to send a follow-up question to that. We have another question from our audience is how to track which content sent to a customer through dynamic content blocks.
How to track what now? How to track
Which content is sent to a customer.
That's impression region tracking.
So they would use impression region tracking for that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, that would be the.
And then besides setting up the additional parameters required for impression region, do they need to set up anything else?
No, not for the standard tracking that it gives you. It really the only thing, I mean, you think through the names that you want to use for your impression regions, and then the content that you want to have in there, and pay particular attention to the alias tags that you're using. But it is a pretty much out the box way of tracking dynamic content. There's not a whole lot that you have to do.
And where do we see the impression region tracking?
In the there's a tracking report that you can pull specifically to impression regions, or a tracking extract. We'll pull impression region tracking as well. I think there's a you can get it off one of the data views too. I'm gonna have to. Kevin, do you know?
Not off the top of my head, no.
No. Yeah.
And then let's say we wanted to find out more information about impression region or dynamic content tracking. Where can you please share the best knowledge or articles to learn more about this? I think we have some folks that are brand new to this and they're really excited about, once this call is done, they're going to try this out. But they're wanting to read some more about this. And I know we're going to share a couple of codes with them, but can we also share a couple of links on where they could read up on this?
Absolutely. There's some there's an article on Salesforce support on the developer.salesforce.com. There's an article on tracking impression regions that's in addition to the function sets around the AMP script that you can use to track impression regions. There's an article about implementing them and tracking content areas as well. And then also there is the AMP script guide, which is Adam Spriggs's and Elliot Harper's book or website. I highly recommend you reading over what they have to say about impression region tracking. That's very informative, and content areas and defining content areas. Using the content area by name block, you can get some impression region, some general tracking around that as well. And it's similar to impression regions, but it's not exactly specific to the region. You can nest multiple content areas inside of one impression region. And then you can also track those individual content areas by name. But I have issue using that method. I'd prefer to uniquely identify my content areas with impression regions, unique impression regions, just simply because it makes it easier to report on the back end, which you do when you get too many nested content areas in one region. It becomes difficult to track which ones are doing what. So we will pass out that information. Do you know of any other resources right off the top of your head, blogs or anything, Kevin?
No, and you pretty much covered the ones that I would reference. I think, yeah, it's I can't think of any other ones that come to mind off the top of my head.
Well, it sounds like we need some blog posts written about it, so I'll jump over to the How to SFMC group, little plug there, and see if we can't get somebody from the community to contribute with a blog post. And if anybody's on the call that wants to contribute, just reach out after and help us out.
We actually have a couple of folks that are asking if you're able to show the process of extracting the data.
The process of extracting the data, so yeah, a tracking extract or querying the data.
Yeah.
Is that
extract? Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that would be in your reporting or done with a tracking extract. There are lots of different ways to extract data from the Marketing Cloud. I'm a SQL fan myself, so I tend to write more reports and query the data, post send, and then extract them to wherever you need them exported to once you're done querying the data. But there is also the reporting studio. Kevin, do you use that frequently?
Yeah, like there is a manual report, but for extracting the data, I would set up tracking extracts. And the thing is, what you're going to need to make sure you do is set up a tracking extract for the click impressions, the send impressions, the send job impressions. Those are the three ones related to impression regions. But it's set up like setting up any other sort of tracking extract. So you're going to first be limited in the look back window. So if you want to go beyond 30 days, you would have to do it multiple times. So what I would probably recommend if you're your tracking extracts based on your send frequency, or what your reporting needs are. For a lot of people, that ends up being a nightly tracking extract. You set that up as a repeating job, but you could also do it on like a weekly basis just to make sure you get all the tracking extracts that you need.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing.
Think about that at the beginning too. Try to set up your tracking extracts before you do anything else in the Marketing Cloud. Like, go ahead and set that up and get that running. And that way you have your data for all time.
So we have another, Carrie came back to clarify her question. For the standard impression region, reporting the impressions shows the plain text version and the HTML. She typically has to manually add the clicks together and then to remove the duplicate impressions counts. Using the data extract, it's hard to bring them together as the links are different and there's no alias.
Sounds like you need to add some alias tags. Yeah. You might have an easier time trying to figure out those clicks if you had some alias tags associated with them, from what that sounds like. Kevin, what do you take away from that?
Yeah, no, that's what I see the question. I was trying to read through it. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested just that there's enough activity too between the two versions.
And she said it's the alias for the plain text.
That's interesting that your subscriber base is opening both versions. Carrie, you sound like you have a very interesting business case there, use case. Maybe we can sync up later on and talk about it. I don't know, Kevin. What do you?
Yeah, I mean, you could. I'm trying to think, like, with the aliases distinguishing between the plain text version and the HTML version. And I am interested too. I'd love to either do some more research on the impression count, because I'm assuming, I don't know if you're using the tracking extract then, if you're looking at the send impressions, because if I understand correctly, that's not really tracking based on the opens, but based on the assignment of the content in the impression region area as the job's processed.
Before it sends.
Before it sends, yeah. So that's why I'm really curious about what the discrepancy is coming from to try and figure that out. I know.
Do you think any virus checkers or anything like that, do you think that could be a problem here for maybe if it's a B2B? And this is pure speculation, Carrie, if you want to. You did not derail the conversation. We appreciate this. This is fabulous.
No, I think this is a great question, and I think we might have some other folks on the line that have something very similar. So I think diving into this, Carrie, is great. So thank you for bringing it up.
But yeah, it's very interesting because the fact that people are opening, they wouldn't even open. Okay, yeah. So yeah, that's very interesting. I'm just going to be quiet now.
So let's look through, and we have some other really good questions around dynamic content tracking, and we have somebody that wants to know, well, what is the difference between normal and standard tracking? Like how and why is dynamic content tracking different from like normal standard tracking?
Kevin?
I mean, I would just sort of an easy way to think about this is if you after you've deployed a campaign, deployed an email, and you go to just the standard tracking, I mean you're going to see the your standard metrics, opens, clicks, bounces, and so on, and within the clicks, you'll, especially if you look on the individual link level view, yes, you will see all of the content that was clicked, but it's just very difficult from there to sort of have that broader view of who was served what particular piece of content, and then you have to do more manipulation to kind of then dig into how many times did the particular dynamic link get clicked, and then you have to back into, well, who was actually going to qualify to get what. So the way I would look at it compared to regular tracking is dynamic content tracking is you're setting yourself up so that you can easily report back on who was served a particular piece of content relative to someone else, and then what did they do with it. But there is just some setup work that you have to do in order to get that visibility in a sort of easy and consumable fashion.
Yeah, and when I think about standard tracking, I think of usually flat HTML, not templatized. You're not actually, for standard tracking, you're not actually sending dynamic images or links or copy or colors or whatever that you're changing for that audience specifically. You're only sending to one audience for standard tracking. So dynamic tracking is more for segmented audiences, and so that you can ensure your subscribers are getting that one-to-one experience that we're all trying to achieve. So that's the end goal, right?
Thank you for that answer. So we're going to go back. We have a couple questions coming in around data extensions. Do we have to worry about purging data in data extensions? I'm looking to use data extensions to display dynamic content on emails to prospect. It could be possible that I have the same user from multiple Salesforce campaigns in the same data extension.
The only time I would purge data from a data extension is if that data extension gets too large to query against, and that, honestly, those data extensions can get massive, and you can break your queries down into multiple sub queries and segments in order to access that data. It might take you a little bit more time, but I don't see a problem in loading up a data extension. You just want to think about how you're using that data and not make it too complex.
Yeah, I would agree. For the most part, you shouldn't need to worry about purging data extension. I think it does depend on the use and how and your setup. If it's a data extension that you're using for a journey or an ongoing sequence of emails versus just kind of um, like an ephemeral campaign, and then the question just becomes, after the fact of the send, like are you going to need to, let's say someone does views a web page, or it's an email that is reliant on data that's in that data extension at the time of open. Those are some things to consider too. But I think it does depend on what your use case is for the campaign or campaigns that you're sending from that one data extension.
Thank you for that. I think that definitely answered the question. So another question is, besides setting up the additional parameters required for logging, what else should be set up for dynamic tracking?
Alias tags. I'm going to say alias tags over and over and over again. Because if you don't have your alias tags, you're not going to be able to get that link tracking. So you're not going to be able to figure out click paths and things like that, and further down the line conversion. So for me, is alias tags. And then if you are going to use dynamic impression regions and content tracking, make sure you have a defined nomenclature and the entire team is apprised of it and everybody's on board with exactly how to implement and report on the tracking you're applying.
Yeah, I would agree. It comes into naming conventions and planning, and so that you have that consistency for your reporting, on what you, and also so that it's clear what content should go into a particular kind of container. But yeah, it's so namings for your content, your impression regions for your content areas, naming conventions for your alias tags. And then also, like if you're going to populate like the web analytics connector string, having some standards around how that's supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
I know we've mentioned alias tags a couple of times. Is there a dynamic way to use alias tags? I think internally, they're finding that rather manual.
There is, but it's a hack. So you can use, you can set an alias tag with a variable using AMP script or SSJS, and then if you're using AMP script, in order to drive that variable into the alias tag, you actually have to build the alias tag with a concatenation function that builds the alias tag inside of the href. And I'll pass out a sample of that whenever in the post send documentation. But again, think about what you're doing there. If you are if you are bringing that alias tag in from a data extension, which you can do very, very easily along with that link, which is very easy to do, just make sure that everybody knows the names. Once again, as long as everybody's communication is important, as long as everybody on the team is aware of what you're doing, how it's functioning, and what the end results are. I think, yeah, there's easy ways to drive in alias tags. Again, though, those are not supported by support from the Marketing Cloud. So if you call support and ask them to help you with that, they're going to send you on your way, tell you to figure it out on your own.
That was a really good question, Jessica. And as Jenna mentioned, as part of the follow-up email, we will be sure to send over some snippets to help you. So please be on the lookout for that. We have another great question. And Kevin and Jenna, I don't know which one of you want to take this. Can you guys speak to how you modify the view as a web page link to track dynamic content if the data extension is reused weekly versus one and done? Oh, I love this question, Mary.
I can start with it. So you know, I'm trying to think through too, like in terms of actually tracking. So the good news is that when a lot of the tracking itself takes place as the job is processed at the time of send. If the question here touches upon, right, I know that if you send dynamic content and it's relying on data in the data extension, and then you overwrite the data extension, because you've changed that source data, you're going to have issues if someone opens that email again in the future, if they do the view as a web page view, or if you're trying to get back to see the original data, it's going to be a problem. And that's where your sendable, your send log data extension can be used. So if you know what dynamic content you want to be able to report on in the future, then what you're going to want to do is make sure your send log data extension has the matching fields to your sendable data extension, so that you capture those data points at the time of send in the send log data extension. And then you can look back at that in order to see what the data was at the time of send, if you know, to inform your reporting. If you discover, or I know in a lot of use cases, right, data is changing a lot and the data that you want to use is changing, and so you don't want to keep on adding fields to the send log DE, and it just becomes unwieldy. And that's where you would then look to create a custom send log, so just a standard data extension, and you're going to do your own logging to it, and then that way you can keep the data there. And then if you do run into, like, if you want to make sure that when people say click on view as a web page and see the email open again, you can change the data extension that's referenced at the time of open by looking at the message context. So you can change the data extension that's used in the email by just being aware of the message context, and then changing the data extension that the data pulls from.
That's the easiest way to do it, and then extend your the link expiration time in your platform out to like 700 days or something like that. I don't know. I've seen it extended out pretty far. I think 780 or something like that is as far as you can go.
I think we got some really good questions today. Not a question, but a comment. And maybe you guys can speak to that. I know myself, I struggled with this when I first started using the platform years ago, but what the comment is really around, for many customers shy away from setting up these tracking abilities available within Salesforce, or the ability to set up something custom. Because it sounds like, you know, when you want to get into the weeds of tracking dynamic content, you know, a lot of this is really customized, because every use case is different, you know, and it dives into the depths of technicality, which a lot of people aren't really comfortable with. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, how do you boost your confidence? Like, how do you get started? Where do you get started? So that you can dive into some of this technicality.
Where do you get started? Wow, that's a broad question. because this is specific to dynamic tracking. And so if you really want to get custom with dynamic tracking, I would say try to learn some AMP script and some of your basic functions in order to track. Someone's going to laugh at me for saying, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, go on. No, finish what you're saying.
I was going to say, and if someone's probably going to laugh at me about this, but if you're unsure, get an Excel and start playing around with just moving data around in Excel and using concat functions there. And I know that sounds funny, but a lot of the function sets transfer over to AMP script pretty easily, and you can kind of make mistakes there, whenever you're applying your tags and things like that and thinking about it before you move into the marketing cloud. So
yeah. And then I was going to say, don't be afraid to break things. Because I mean, I know even just from us talking this morning, right, it's a lot of still theoretical and conceptual stuff. I would say don't be afraid to go in and just create yourself a small data extension, even if it's just your business address and your work address or your personal email address, and like Jenna said, start to just practice using the different parts of the platform and see what happens. And then I do find that Stack Exchange is a great place to go to get help, especially on more technical stuff like this. On there are a lot of people who are very willing to review code and give you feedback, and usually they're very quick to give you that feedback.
And there's other communities as well. If Stack Exchange isn't comfortable for you, there's the Email Geek community that you can reach out to, How to SFMC community. We're all here for you. And like Kevin said, there's a large community on Stack Exchange as well that can help out and point you in the right direction, give you resources to help you learn. But don't be afraid to break things. And when you do start using your real data, always just export it to the FTP real fast. Just take your data extension that the live data that you're manipulating, drop it on the FTP. It's going to be there for 21 days. If you need to revert and overwrite your data sets, you can. It's available for you. Always back up your stuff. I do that constantly. So, and don't be scared. Show no fear.
I know, definitely don't be scared, especially when you're working in the marketing cloud. I know it's hard, it's easier said than done, but that's why we're all trailblazers.
Once you break a few things, it won't bother you to break things anymore, trust me.
Right, exactly. Kevin, I'm actually going to go back to the question. I'm sorry folks for jumping around a bit, but Antonio came back. And he's saying, the problem, it was his earlier question about dynamic tracking and the view as a web page and how that can populate if he's sending another campaign. The problem is that you can include name, surname, invoice number, for example, but next month you send another with name, coupon code, expiration date, for example. He says, I shouldn't be including those new fields in the send log because each time he would end up with a send log with 300 fields, correct?
Correct. That's one of the challenges that you have to manage with the system send log is, it's only going to track the fields that are in the send log, and so yes, you can quickly end up, it grows from the original half a dozen fields. You can end up with 50 fields, and then it's unwieldy and it's difficult to work with. So if you are in that situation where you find that the data that you're going to want to track is going to change frequently from send to send, then you're going to want to start to build into your process setting up a custom send log. Maybe one way of doing it is if you organize your campaigns like a campaign type. Let's say you have a coupon-based email versus a regular email. So then maybe you want to develop a process for those coupon emails, you use a certain send log data extension that you've created that accounts for those data points. That's what you're going to have to do. Otherwise, yes, you would be continually adding fields to your send log DE, which you don't really want to do. You want to try and manage those fields quite tightly.
Yeah, that's definitely a tough one to answer, Antonio, but if we could send you any additional information in that follow-up email or reach out to you separately, please feel free to message us your email address and we can continue the conversation. I know we're close to the hour, but there is one thing we have not spoken about, and Mary just submitted a question. We haven't mentioned AMP script at all. We have, but we haven't really touched on some of the questions around AMP script. And Mary just asked a question, a really good one. Do you use AMP script to write specific variables to separate data extensions upon send? I think you can only have one send log per business unit or per account, depending on how your account is set up.
Yes, and we touched on that at the beginning about, yes, you're absolutely right. You can only have one send log for your account overall, but you can create many custom send logs. And what Kevin was just speaking to about creating the custom send log to add so that you don't end up with 300 different variables would be done with AMP script. You would need to do an upsert or insert DE at the time of send in order to capture the data that you're trying to capture at time of send. Or pull it or query against it, have that data stored prior to send somewhere that you can query against post send. The easiest way to do would be to create a custom send log there, just like with AMP script, just like Kevin was just speaking to. Sorry, I took over that one, Kevin. Anything else?
No, you're good. It's funny just because it is really this is where nomenclature in Marketing Cloud can sometimes get confusing, because yes, there is the system generated send log data extension that you can create and use, but then everything else we're going to have to make sure we reference it says your own custom send log, because I know I've had times where people created a send log and they just called it send log and then wondered why it didn't automatically capture data. And you're right, that when you create your custom data extension to use as a send log for campaigns, you're going to have to populate it using AMP script, because it's not going to get in there otherwise.
Have to use AMP script for that.
AMP script, our favorite.
Love language.
Yeah. So we only have a minute left, but I do want to ask this other question. Is there a way to modify a job link since the email has already been sent out, where the link was dynamically pulled earlier? If yes, do they need to add a tracking to the link manually then? Ooh.
So you can modify the link post send in Content Builder. You can't in Journey Builder or not in Content Builder. I'm sorry. Yeah, in Content Builder, when you're sending from there, you can modify the link post send. You can't modify the alias tag post send if that's what you were asking. But you can't modify anything post send in Journey Builder at the moment.
Thank you for that. I hope that answered your question. Again, this was a really, really tough conversation that we had today, but we are up at the hour, and I really want to thank Kevin and Jenna for discussing all things related to tracking dynamic content. And I think what I'd love to do is, as part of the follow-up email, there are a lot of great questions that we might not have gotten to, but there are also some that required follow-up, from us sending you some snippets to providing you links to resources so that you can get some additional information on tracking dynamic content. So we will be sure to include that in the follow-up email that you'll either receive tomorrow or on Thursday. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate it. Be sure to join us next week. On Tuesday, we are going to dive deep into the Marketing Cloud connector. And then following Thursday, we are going to dive deep into building out custom content blocks using SDK. So thanks again, everyone, for joining. Looking forward to you joining us next time, and feel free to share these webinars with your colleagues. Have a good day.
Thanks. Bye.